there were some big events in the last couple of weeks. Talk to me about the things that have happened over the past few weeks. You could locate that wherever you'd like, right? There's the Kimi K3 release of and a kind of increasing conversation about open source Chinese models and potentially what the role for regulators might be in that space. There's been the news that OpenAI's collection of models, while undergoing a cyber evaluation, escaped their sandbox and went on a little escapade to Hugging Face, and of course, seemingly partly in response to that, certainly in response to the momentum that came off the Kimi K3 release, there was a letter signed by many leaders in the tech sector who stand to benefit from a more open AI industry that was released quite recently on behalf and kind of calling for a thriving open model ecosystem. So from your perspective, James, what have you been thinking about in the last couple of weeks, and what are your equities in these issues?
Yeah, I think you kind of like hit the nail on the head on some of the big threads that have been getting pulled there because really I feel like in some respects when we're looking at this conversation around AI, in some ways it's really just like same conversations that get like, they get a little flash in the frying pan moment and then they die off and then they come right back again. You mentioned
Mm,
the Kimi K3 release, and I'm old enough to
mm,
remember just last year when we were talking about DeepSeek and its model getting released and the scare that put through the markets and in Washington, D.C. about what
yeah, for
that
sure.
meant. And then by extension, the release of these Chinese models and what does that mean for the overarching global race for AI? I have a lot of
Mm,
conversations with lawmakers and other people about the status of this global race for American leadership in artificial intelligence and what does
mm,
that require. The good news is that when we're looking at that, is that the United States is thankfully in the position where we are largely leading in this race. If we
mm,
if we can keep it, right? There are active choices that are getting, thrown out there casually, whether that's, trying to put out a full moratorium on data center construction across the country or banning it on federal land or
mm,
taking 50% equity stakes in these companies. There's all different kinds of little policy conversations that I've been kind of monitoring. Some are a little bit more crazy than others, but at the end of the day, you still have to kind of respond to them all because if you just let them sit there and fester, they might become something more serious. And then,
yeah,
there's
for
a lot of
sure.
momentum and it becomes a lot more problematic. So the open source conversation is definitely very real. You mentioned the incident with OpenAI and Hugging Face having a little hacking fun there. But I do think that I do think that the interesting side bit of that was that, okay, so that incident did happen, but that company was then forced to go and rely on a Chinese open source model to go and get
Yeah.
themselves out of the bind because these frontier lab companies had basically gone and put restrictions over how you can go and utilize these tools in such a
Yeah.
way where Hugging Face could not go and leverage those frontier labs to go and tackle the problem, right? So they're relying on Chinese open source models to get that done, and
Mm,
I think that there's a conversation to be had around that insofar as that we're worried about China. That's I think a very common theme. Lawmakers are certainly very wary about what happens if we let this go and permeate deeper into our infrastructure stack. I mean, historically, we've thought about this with respect to routers and our
mm,
telecommunications infrastructure, where we've seen now in our
mm,
broadband deployment, for example, the FCC has spent billions of dollars years later trying to rip out Chinese hardware because of concerns about espionage and other kinds of things, right? And the same conversations are transporting over to AI today. Now, I
yeah.
think the good news with that for software is that it's actually a lot easier to go and take an open weight model like Kimi K3 and download that into a local sandbox secure environment, test and prod it for those kinds of vulnerabilities, and then run it in your own ecosystem, devoid of
Yeah.
any of those kinds of potential deficiencies and risks.
Mm,
And I think that that's something that gets lacked in the conversation sometimes when it comes to open source and what that means. But in the meantime, there are other vested interests in a closed source ecosystem, without naming names, that would rather go and see that technology gets shuttered and put on the side. I don't think that that's the right answer here. You don't have
mm,
America leading and winning when you basically tell our hundreds of thousands of engineers that are constantly working in the open source community to go and iterate and improve this technology constantly to go and basically take a seat. That's not great. But if we were to go and according to one Harvard study, right, if we were to go and have to take all the open source out and put everything into a closed proprietary system, Harvard, I think, estimated that cost to be around $8 trillion. And that sounds fantastic if you're a frontier lab, not so great if you're a business. So I think that those are some of the, I think, kind of chief things that we're seeing kind of play out here. You mentioned the letter that was gone and put out by over 20 some odd organizations that Microsoft led. Microsoft, a company that just 26 years ago had a massive antitrust suit over its closed ecosystem at the time. So it's kind of an interesting kind of a full circle moment now when you have Microsoft going and advocating for an open source, protection and recognizing the value that's getting brought there. Notably, one of the chief premier frontier labs that we have there in Anthropic did not go and sign on to that letter. Still, as of this moment, as I understand it, has not signed on to that letter.
Yeah.
NVIDIA has taken it one step further. They created an alliance for secure open AI. That's
Yeah.
understanding the benefits of open source AI. So I think that that's another conversation that we're going to have to continue to monitor and see how that continues to unveil, whether or not we get more companies to go and sign up for this kind of a thing. Because I think that ultimately what this comes down to, going back to my original point here, is how does the United States lead and win in the global race for AI? It's by going and leveraging both. It's not saying that you have to have an ecosystem that's run purely on open source. It's not purely closed source. The United States, what our special sauce has always been, is that we recognize the value of when that trade-off is actually appropriate, and we let them both run free, and we leverage them to our maximum capability there. So I think those are kind of the big threads that I'm monitoring when I'm looking at AI policy right now.